Section 1. The Road to Bosworth, a King Surrounded by Enemies. The year was 1485, a time when the air of England still smelled faintly of war and uncertainty. The crown had changed hands too many times in too few years. The Wars of the Roses, that long and tangled struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster, had drained the realm of peace and trust alike. And at its heart stood a king who many feared, many misunderstood, and some quietly admired. Richard III. To truly understand his mysterious death, one must first step into the political storm that surrounded him, a storm not of swords alone, but of whispers, betrayal, and the slow erosion of loyalty that would finally deliver him to Bosworth Field. Richard was never meant to be king. He was the younger brother of Edward IV, a towering figure whose victories had restored the House of York to power after years of bloodshed. For most of his life, Richard was a loyal servant to his brother, governing the north of England with rare competence and fairness. His reputation there was one of justice. He listened to the grievances of farmers, merchants, and knights alike, earning a level of respect unusual for a royal. But when Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, everything changed. His heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old, a child too young to rule. Richard was named Protector of the Realm, a title that should have been temporary. Yet within weeks, the situation darkened. Allegations surfaced that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, that their children were illegitimate. Parliament, influenced by Richard's allies, declared the young prince unfit to rule. And so, on July 6, 1483, Richard was crowned king. To some, this was a lawful act, the prevention of chaos. To others, it was usurpation. And when the two young princes, Edward and his brother Richard, disappeared within the Tower of London, suspicion quickly turned toward their uncle. It is perhaps here, even before Bosworth, that Richard's doom was sealed. The disappearance of the princes created a wound in the English conscience that no victory or act of governance could heal. Though no proof ever surfaced, the shadow of guilt clung to him. Nobles who once swore allegiance began to drift away. Even those who believed him innocent could see that public opinion had turned irrevocably against him. The rebellion came swiftly. Henry Tudor, a distant claimant of the Lancastrian line, saw his chance. He had spent much of his life in exile in France, a fugitive prince without a kingdom. But the death of Edward IV and the unpopularity of Richard's rule breathed new life into his ambitions. He gathered mercenaries, sailors, and disaffected Englishmen, a small but determined force. In the summer of 1485, he landed in Wales, marching eastward under the banner of the Red Dragon, the ancient symbol of Welsh prophecy. Each mile brought more men to his side, some out of hope, others out of fear, many out of quiet resentment for the king they now served. Richard was not blind to this growing threat. He gathered his armies, the largest England had seen in decades, and set out from Nottingham to meet Henry on the open field. But even as he prepared for war, his enemies were already within his own camp. Among the most dangerous of them was Lord Thomas Stanley, whose loyalties had always been as fluid as the wind. He was stepfather to Henry Tudor, but had long served Richard's crown. Richard held Stanley's son hostage to ensure his loyalty. A shrewd but desperate move that revealed how fragile trust had become. In these final days, Richard's letters show a man deeply aware of his peril. "We be in good hope," he wrote to his allies. "Yet I pray you send us word of your coming." Behind those formal words lay anxiety. He could sense the threads of loyalty unraveling. As the two armies drew closer, England itself seemed to hold its breath. Bosworth Field, near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, was an unremarkable patch of farmland. Yet destiny had chosen it as the stage for the end of an era. Richard's army vastly outnumbered Henry's, and by all logic, victory should have been certain. He had the advantage in men, in armor, and in position. But numbers mean little when hearts waver. Many of his nobles remembered the whispers, the vanished princes, the fear that surrounded the court. Some secretly wondered if the crown itself was cursed. On the eve of battle, chroniclers imagined the king unable to sleep, pacing, thinking, staring into the dark. He had ruled only 2 years, yet his reign felt longer, burdened by the weight of suspicion and treachery. And yet those who served closest to him described a man still proud, still certain of his right to rule. He ordered his crown, the very symbol of his kingship, to be brought into his tent, keeping it near, as if to remind himself of his divine authority. The next morning, he would wear that same crown into battle, not as a symbol of fear, but of defiance. The dawn of August 22nd, 1485, came heavy and gray. The battlefield was wet from rain, the grass slick beneath the soldiers' boots. Trumpets sounded, banners rose, and the thunder of hooves echoed across the plain. Richard mounted his horse, a white steed named White Surrey, and surveyed the field. Ahead of him, Henry Tudor's army waited, smaller but unified. To his flanks stood the forces of Stanley, their intentions uncertain. To his rear, men who called him king, but whose eyes betrayed hesitation. The storm was about to break, and within hours, a crown would lie in the mud. At that moment, Richard III was not the villain of Shakespeare's imagination, nor the scheming usurper of Tudor propaganda. He was simply a man, isolated by the weight of power, standing on the edge of destiny. He could not know that this battle, his last, would echo across 5 centuries, or that his bones would one day be found beneath a modern car park, telling a story that history had long forgotten. The road to Bosworth was paved with loyalty and betrayal, courage and ambition, faith and fear. And it would end, as all roads of power do, in the silence of death. Section 2. The battle begins. Richard's final charge. Dawn broke over Bosworth Field, with a low mist hanging just above the wet grass, as if the world itself hesitated to reveal what would soon unfold. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that thickens the lungs and slows every heartbeat. Somewhere in that fog stood 2 men whose destinies were now bound together. King Richard III, the last Plantagenet monarch of England, and Henry Tudor, the uncertain claimant, whose name few in England had ever spoken before. The morning began with quiet movements, men tightening the straps of their armor, horses snorting clouds of steam, commanders whispering last-minute orders, the faint sounds of steel being drawn and the creak of leather filled the air. And above all, the flutter of banners, the white boar of Richard, bold against the gray sky, facing the red dragon of Henry Tudor, a symbol born of prophecy and hope. Richard had arranged his army carefully. He held the high ground, a vital advantage. His forces were divided into three main divisions. The vanguard, led by the Duke of Norfolk, the main body under Richard himself, and the rear guard, commanded by the Earl of Northumberland. It was a classic, disciplined formation, the mark of a king who knew war as well as politics. Henry Tudor, on the other hand, had no such experience. His army was smaller, more fragile, made up of mercenaries, Welsh archers, and exiled Englishmen who gambled their lives on the promise of a different future. But what he lacked in numbers, he possessed in unity, and in the quiet, watchful loyalty of Thomas Stanley, the most unpredictable figure on the field. Stanley and his brother Sir William had brought thousands of men, but they stood apart, waiting, neither joining Richard nor Henry. Their forces loomed on the edges of the battlefield, a silent reminder that at any moment, the tide could turn. The first sounds of war came not as a shout, but as a murmur. Archers advancing, their bows raised, their faces expressionless. When the order was given, arrows tore through the mist, slicing the dawn into fragments. The sharp hiss of flight was followed by the dull thud of impact. Men fell where they stood. Others stumbled forward, driven by momentum and fear. Then came the clash of steel. Norfolk's vanguard met Henry's front lines in a storm of noise. Metal on metal, cries of pain, the chaotic rhythm of battle. The ground turned slick beneath the soldiers' boots, churned by mud and blood alike. From his position atop White Surrey, Richard watched the field with sharp, restless eyes. His command was calm, deliberate. He rode among his men, shouting encouragement, his voice steady and unwavering. Chroniclers later wrote that he fought as though he were determined to conquer or die as king. And perhaps even then, he knew it would be one or the other. As the battle raged, messengers galloped to and from Richard's position. Reports came in confusion. Parts of Henry's line were faltering, others pushing forward. Norfolk, loyal to the end, was struck down by an arrow through the face. Northumberland, inexplicably, held his forces back, refusing to commit his troops when they were most needed. Whether through hesitation, fear, or betrayal, his inaction left Richard dangerously exposed. And still, the Stanleys watched. Then, through the chaos, Richard saw something that would change the course of history. Henry Tudor himself, surrounded by a small personal guard, had ridden slightly away from his main force, perhaps to confer with Stanley. It was a risk, one that did not escape the king's notice. In that instant, Richard made a decision that would immortalize him. He spurred his horse forward, shouting, "Treason! Treason! Treason!" Richard charged directly toward Henry, cutting through the melee like a thunderbolt. Around him, his personal knights followed, perhaps fewer than 100 men, riding headlong into thousands. It was madness, but it was also magnificent. He struck first at Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, cutting him down with a single blow. The royal banner, Henry's red dragon, fell to the mud. Then he struck again, unhorsing Sir John Cheney, one of the tallest knights in England, sending him sprawling to the ground. Each strike was fueled by fury and the desperate dignity of a man, refusing to surrender what was rightfully his. Richard's charge carved straight through Henry's guard. He was within mere feet of his rival when fate, or treachery, intervened. The Stanley forces, who until now had remained motionless, suddenly surged forward. They did not join Richard. They joined Henry. The king found himself surrounded, his small band cut off from retreat. He fought on, refusing to yield, his sword flashing through the press of men. Chroniclers claimed he struck down several attackers, even after his horse was slain beneath him. Crawling from the fallen animal, Richard continued to fight on foot, mud spattering his armor, blood soaking his surcoat. It was here, in this desperate circle of struggle, that the last Plantagenet made his stand. One chronicler later wrote that Richard cried aloud that he was betrayed, and that he would yet die a king. Others recalled his final blows, fierce, unyielding, as if to carve his name into the memory of those who watched. When he finally fell, it was not from cowardice or flight, but from sheer exhaustion, overwhelmed by numbers, hacked down in the chaos. His crown, the same one he had carried into battle, was said to have rolled from his head into the mud, where it was found moments later by a soldier loyal to Henry. That crown was placed upon Henry Tudor's head by Lord Stanley himself, a symbol of how swiftly fortune can turn. The field fell quiet soon after. The mist, which had clung to the land since dawn, began to lift, revealing the devastation beneath. Broken spears, bodies of men and horses, banners torn and trampled. Somewhere among them lay Richard, the last English king to die in battle. When the victors found his body, they stripped it of armor, slung it naked across a horse, and paraded it through the streets of Leicester. His wounds told the story of his end. Blows to the head, the ribs, and back, but no sign of cowardice, no mark of retreat. His face, once sharp and proud, was now still. And yet, the legend had only just begun. For even in death, Richard refused to disappear quietly into history. His grave would be lost, his memory twisted by the victors, and his name reshaped by centuries of propaganda. But in that final, defiant charge, that moment when he saw death and rode toward it, he ensured that his story would be remembered, not as that of a villain, but as that of a man who fought to the very last breath for his crown. The battlefield at Bosworth was silent once more, but somewhere, in the wet earth where a crown had fallen, the echoes of hooves and the cry of a horse, my kingdom for a horse, would linger, not just as Shakespeare's invention, but as a haunting whisper of truth. Section 3. The Aftermath. The King's Lost Body. The battle was over. The air at Bosworth Field grew still, except for the cawing of crows and the slow groans of the wounded. Smoke drifted over the damp ground, curling around the fallen like a mournful shroud. Soldiers moved through the haze, stripping armor, looting weapons, or searching for lost companions. The earth was thick with the scent of iron and rain. Among the dead lay England's last Plantagenet king, Richard III, face down in the mud, his body half covered by the cloak of a fallen knight. To the men who found him, there was no mistaking who he was. His hair was dark and matted, his face pale and sharp, and around his neck a golden chain still gleamed. This was no ordinary corpse. This was royalty brought low. Yet there was no ceremony for him that day. Richard's body was lifted roughly onto a horse, his head and limbs dangling lifelessly. The once proud monarch, who had ridden into battle in shining armor beneath the banner of the white boar, was now a spectacle for the victors. The soldiers who escorted his body back to Leicester did not march solemnly. They jeered, spat, and laughed as they rode. Behind them, peasants gathered to watch, some in silence, others whispering prayers. It was said that the corpse was brought to an inn known as the Blue Boar, though others claimed it was the Newark Inn. There it was displayed for 2 days, so that all might see proof that the tyrant was truly dead, and yet the sight was not what anyone expected. Chroniclers wrote that Richard's body bore a dozen wounds, most inflicted after his death. His head had been split open, his cheek gashed, his ribs pierced. But the most curious part of all, and one that would puzzle historians centuries later, was the evidence of deliberate humiliation, cuts to the buttocks, inflicted when he was already lifeless. This was no ordinary end for a king. It was retribution. For years, Richard's enemies had painted him as a usurper, a murderer, even a devil. His death was meant to cleanse England of his memory, to mark the triumph of divine justice. And so, his body was treated as a trophy, a warning to others who might defy the new Tudor regime. Henry VII ordered that Richard be buried quickly and quietly, without royal honors. No grand tomb, no funeral procession, no mourning. The body of the king was given to the monks of Greyfriars, a Franciscan monastery in Leicester. There, in a small chapel, beneath the floor of the choir, they dug a shallow grave, too short for a man of his stature, forcing them to tilt his head slightly forward. And with that, the earth swallowed England's last medieval king. But the story did not end with his burial. It was only beginning to fade into legend. Within months, rumors began to swirl. Some claimed the monks had secretly taken Richard's body and reburied it elsewhere to protect it from desecration. Others whispered that the grave had been destroyed when the monastery was later torn down. Over the centuries, Leicester grew and changed. Houses, taverns, and shops rose where Greyfriars once stood. The memory of Richard's final resting place vanished beneath the cobblestones. His enemies ensured that even his reputation was buried with him. Henry VII, eager to legitimize his reign, ordered a rewriting of Richard's story. Chroniclers and poets painted him as a deformed, ruthless villain, a king who murdered his own nephews, who schemed and killed to climb the throne. These tales would later inspire Shakespeare's depiction of Richard as the hunchbacked tyrant who cried, "My kingdom for a horse." But for centuries, few ever questioned whether that image was fair. It was as though Richard III had died twice, once on Bosworth Field, and again in history. Yet not everyone believed the official tale. In the centuries that followed, Quiet debates persisted. Some historians wondered if Richard had truly been the monster his enemies claimed. Letters and records revealed a more complex man, intelligent, pragmatic, even compassionate toward the poor. Others pointed out that many of the accusations against him emerged only after his death, written by those who stood to gain from his downfall. But without a body, there was little proof to challenge the myth. His bones, like his honor, were lost to time. Then, in 2012, more than 500 years after his death, a remarkable discovery would reignite the mystery. A team of archaeologists, historians, and volunteers from the Richard III Society began a project to locate his long-lost grave. Their research led them to a nondescript car park in the heart of Leicester, once believed to be the site of the old Greyfriars Monastery. Few took the project seriously. Even the team members themselves spoke of it as a long shot. But then, almost immediately after digging began, they uncovered human bones. The skeleton was found beneath the foundations of what had once been a choir area, precisely where records said Richard had been buried. The bones were twisted slightly to one side, as if laid in a grave too small. And when the soil was brushed away, the archaeologists saw something astonishing. The spine was curved, a severe scoliosis, the same deformity described by chroniclers who had written about the king's crooked back. Could it truly be him? For months, scientists worked in silence. The bones were examined, measured, and scanned. Wounds were catalogued, the same kind described in 1485. Massive trauma to the skull, slashes across the ribs, and a sharp blade mark to the pelvis, consistent with a blow delivered after death. Then, the most definitive test of all, DNA. Samples taken from the bones were compared to living descendants of Richard's maternal line. Against all odds, the results were a perfect match. It was him. After half a millennium beneath the earth, the last Plantagenet king had been found beneath a parking lot. A discovery that startled the world and rewrote history. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The centuries of distortion, propaganda, and legend began to unravel. For the first time, people saw Richard not as Shakespeare's villain, but as a man, a flawed, determined, deeply human figure whose story had been stolen by those who followed. When his remains were reburied in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, the ceremony was everything his first burial had not been. Solemn, dignified, and filled with quiet reverence. As the choir sang and candles flickered, his coffin, carved from English oak and lined with lead, was lowered into the earth once more, this time beneath a carved stone bearing his name. The centuries-old injustice was, in some small way, undone. And as the world watched, the mist that had lingered over Bosworth Field all those years ago seemed at last to lift. Section 4. The Man Behind the Myth. What was Richard really like? It is one thing to speak of a king as he appears in the pages of history, and quite another to seek the man behind the crown, the person who breathed, felt, and lived within the armor. For centuries, Richard III has existed as a caricature, the hunchbacked villain, the child murderer, the schemer who would stop at nothing for power. But strip away the shadows of Tudor propaganda and Shakespearean drama, and a different picture begins to emerge, one not of a monster, but of a man shaped by tragedy, loyalty, and circumstance. Richard was born on October 2nd, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle, the youngest son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, a powerful noblewoman often called the Rose of Raby. He entered a world torn by conflict. The turbulent years of the Wars of the Roses, when two rival branches of the royal family, the Yorks and the Lancasters, fought bitterly for the English throne. From the very beginning, Richard's childhood was steeped in uncertainty. His father's claim to the crown set his family against the reigning King Henry VI, and young Richard learned early that loyalty could be both noble and deadly. When he was just 8 years old, his father and older brother Edmund were killed in battle, their heads displayed on the gates of York. For a child, this was not a lesson in politics. It was a lesson in survival. Richard and his brother George were sent into hiding in Burgundy under the protection of their cousin, the Duke of Burgundy. There, he would have been introduced to the structured courts of continental Europe, the polished manners, the discipline, the language of diplomacy. When he returned to England, he was no longer the frightened boy who had fled. He was becoming something else, careful, observant, and ambitious, but not cruel. He joined his older brother Edward, who would soon become King Edward IV, in campaigns across the country. Even as a teenager, Richard distinguished himself on the battlefield. Chroniclers described him as fearless, charging into combat with a kind of calm precision that inspired his men. By the age of 19, he was already one of the most trusted commanders in his brother's army. But behind that soldier's poise, there was something more introspective, a reflective quality that many would later overlook. Unlike Edward, who was charming and extravagant, Richard was private, studious, and deeply loyal. He was known to attend Mass daily, to read philosophy, and to take a keen interest in matters of law and justice. He founded a Council of the North, a governing body that helped administer fair rule in regions often ignored by London's elite. Records show he even intervened personally in cases involving the poor, ensuring they received hearings regardless of rank. This, perhaps, was the side of Richard that history tried to forget: the reformer, the man who valued order and fairness. But power, once touched, rarely leaves the hands it favors untouched. In 1483, fate turned sharply. King Edward IV died suddenly, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as heir. Richard, as the boy's uncle, was named Lord Protector, tasked with guiding and protecting the young king until his coronation. But within weeks, rumors spread that Edward's marriage had been illegitimate, and that his sons were therefore not true heirs. Here, the story begins to blur into myth and accusation. According to Tudor chroniclers, Richard seized the throne out of greed. He imprisoned his nephews in the Tower of London, declared them illegitimate, and took the crown for himself. The boys, known as the princes in the Tower, vanished soon after, and their disappearance became one of England's greatest mysteries. Yet modern historians paint a more complex picture. There is little contemporary evidence proving Richard ordered their deaths. Some documents suggest that he may have intended to keep them alive, but under guard, fearing they might become pawns for rebellion. Others propose that they were killed later, perhaps under the orders of Henry Tudor's supporters, seeking to discredit Richard's rule. What is certain is that the disappearance of those two boys cast a long shadow, one that would haunt Richard until his death at Bosworth. Still, during his brief reign of just over 2 years, Richard accomplished things that reveal a very different kind of monarch. He introduced laws protecting the right to bail, ensuring that those accused of crimes could not be imprisoned indefinitely without trial. He implemented measures to curb corruption among officials, standardized property rights, and supported the translation of legal documents into English, so ordinary people could understand the laws that governed them. For a medieval king, these acts were radical. He was also a patron of education and religion, founding colleges and endowing churches. He even funded scholarships for young scholars, believing that knowledge was the truest form of stability. And yet, no matter how many good deeds he performed, Richard's reputation was already turning against him. The Tudor dynasty, led by Henry VII, who defeated him at Bosworth, had every reason to destroy his image. To secure their legitimacy, they needed Richard to be remembered not as a noble king, but as a tyrant. Henry commissioned chroniclers like Thomas More to craft the tale of the twisted villain. The printing press, still relatively new, spread these stories far and wide, embedding them into the collective imagination of England. When Shakespeare later took up the story, more than a century after Richard's death, he found in it the perfect tragedy, a dark, ambitious man consumed by his own hunger for power. It was brilliant drama, but poor history. And yet, the play became so influential that its words replaced the truth. In the public mind, Richard became the very embodiment of evil, the crook-backed king whose soul was as bent as his spine. But the discovery of his skeleton in 2012, centuries later, offered a quieter, more human truth. The curve in his spine was real, yes, but it was not monstrous. His scoliosis would have made one shoulder higher than the other, yet it would not have crippled him. He would have been perfectly capable of riding, fighting, and commanding an army. In fact, the evidence of healed injuries suggests he had endured years of combat with remarkable resilience. Even in death, his bones spoke of discipline, courage, and endurance. Perhaps that is the lesson of Richard III, that history's villains are rarely born evil. They are made so by the hands that write their stories. When we look beyond the rumors and the politics, what remains is something deeply human. A man who loved his family, who believed in law and loyalty, who rose from tragedy and fell by betrayal. His reign may have been brief, but it left ripples that continue to reach us centuries later. And in those ripples, we can still sense him, not the villain, not the hero, but the man. Section 5, The Princes in the Tower, the darkest mystery of all. It is one of the most haunting questions in all of English history. What truly happened to the two young princes locked away in the Tower of London, whose disappearance would echo through the centuries like a whisper in stone. Their story begins not with malice, but with confusion, a moment in history when power hung in delicate balance, and the difference between a protector and a usurper could be measured in silence, in secrecy, and in fear. The year was 1483, and King Edward IV had just died suddenly, leaving behind a nation still raw from decades of civil war. His heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old, a bright, serious boy who had inherited both his father's sharp mind and his mother's political instincts. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, was just 9, when their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector. Few could have guessed how swiftly the course of their lives would change. At first, everything seemed orderly. Richard escorted his nephew, the new king, from Ludlow to London, preparing for his coronation. But rumors began to stir, whispers that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, making their sons illegitimate. In the court of politics, whispers can move armies. The coronation was postponed. The young king was housed in the Tower of London, not as a prisoner, but under protection, or so it seemed. His younger brother soon joined him, and then the doors closed. The Tower was not always a place of imprisonment. In those days, it was both fortress and palace, home to royal apartments overlooking the Thames. The boys would have had rooms adorned with tapestries, fine beds, and servants to attend them. But as the weeks passed, their household shrank. Fewer attendants came and went. Fewer meals were delivered. The laughter that once echoed through the stone halls began to fade. Then, one summer evening, the boys were seen playing in the garden, and after that, they were never seen again. No one truly knows what happened next. No written record survives. No official report was made. There were only rumors that the boys had been quietly smothered in their sleep, that their bodies had been buried beneath the stairs, that their uncle, now crowned King Richard III, had given the order. The story spread like wildfire, nurtured by those who sought to weaken Richard's claim to the throne. And yet, for all its power, it was a story built on shadows. Contemporary evidence is scarce. None of Richard's surviving letters or records mention the boys' deaths. No eyewitnesses ever came forward. Some scholars suggest that the princes may have lived for months, perhaps even years, after Richard's coronation. Others propose that they were killed not by Richard, but by agents of Henry Tudor, who would later seize the throne and needed their disappearance to be complete in order to justify his own rule. The truth, buried beneath politics and fear, remains one of history's most tightly sealed secrets. But if we cannot know what happened, we can still feel what it meant. To the people of England, the disappearance of the princes was like the sudden extinguishing of light. For all the weariness that war had brought, they had hoped the next generation might bring peace. 2 innocent boys, heirs to a fractured kingdom, became symbols of lost innocence itself. In time, this grief hardened into myth. Chroniclers of the Tudor age painted Richard as the archetype of treachery, the uncle who murdered his nephews for power. Their words became the foundation for centuries of storytelling, culminating in Shakespeare's Richard III, where the king's guilt is absolute and his soul visibly corrupted. But beneath that crafted narrative, the historical trail tells a quieter, more ambiguous tale. Consider this. Even in the turbulent years that followed, there were no official charges brought against Richard for the murder of the princes. None of his closest allies deserted him over it, and when Henry VII came to power, his government never produced the bodies, nor definitive proof of Richard's guilt. If the truth had been so simple, why did it remain unspoken? Perhaps the answer lies within the tower itself, in its stone corridors, its echoing stairways, and the strange way its past still breathes beneath the surface of the modern city. In 1674, almost 2 centuries later, a team of workmen demolishing a staircase in the White Tower uncovered a small wooden box. Inside, they found 2 tiny skeletons. They were buried beneath layers of rubble, hidden deep within the stone. King Charles II ordered that the bones be placed in an urn and reinterred in Westminster Abbey, where they still rest today, beneath a plaque reading simply, "These are believed to be the bones of the princes in the tower." But were they truly the lost princes? When scientists examined the remains centuries later, the findings were inconclusive. The bones belonged to 2 children of roughly the right age, yes, but they had been buried hastily, and there was no definitive evidence of their royal identity. Modern DNA testing could, in theory, solve the mystery, but the Church has so far refused to exhume them again, and so the question endures, locked in time. Were they murdered? Were they hidden? Or were they perhaps spirited away to live in exile under false names, their existence kept secret to preserve a fragile peace? Some have even claimed that the younger prince, Richard of York, may have survived, that he grew into the enigmatic figure known as Perkin Warbeck, a man who appeared years later in Henry VII's reign, claiming to be the lost prince returned from the dead. Warbeck's story, part truth, part theater, enthralled Europe. He spoke fluent English and French, knew details of the royal family that few outsiders could, and bore a striking resemblance to Edward IV. Even foreign courts recognized him as a legitimate heir. Henry VII had him executed, of course, calling him an impostor, but the question lingered. How could a commoner have known so much? Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps it was the last whisper of a vanished royal bloodline. What is certain is that the fate of the princes transformed more than just one dynasty. It shaped how the English people came to view their monarchy. It blurred the line between ruler and villain, between justice and ambition, between the man and the myth. When we stand today before the Tower of London, with its thick walls and iron gates, we can almost sense their presence still. 2 young souls caught forever between history and legend. Their story reminds us that power once seized always demands a price, and sometimes the cost is innocence itself. The mystery of the princes in the tower remains unsolved, and perhaps that is fitting. For not all truths in history are meant to be unearthed. Some are meant to linger the quiet spaces between fact and faith, where imagination keeps their voices alive. Section 6. The Battle of Bosworth, the King's Final Stand. The summer of 1485 was heavy with tension, the kind that settles over a land that knows a storm is coming. Across England, the air seemed to vibrate with rumor. Armies were gathering. Allegiances were shifting like sand. And at the heart of it all stood King Richard III, determined, proud, and alone. The Wars of the Roses, that long, tangled struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster, had exhausted the kingdom. Families had been torn apart, loyalties traded for survival. Richard, crowned only 2 years earlier, had spent his reign fighting ghosts. The ghosts of accusation, of betrayal, and of those 2 missing princes who haunted his name like shadows on the throne. Now, across the Channel, Henry Tudor, a distant claimant from the House of Lancaster, was preparing to challenge him. Henry's claim to the throne was tenuous. His royal blood ran through the illegitimate Beaufort line, but he had something Richard lacked: momentum. On August 7, 1485, Henry landed at Mill Bay in Wales with around 2,000 soldiers, French mercenaries, Welsh supporters, and a handful of English exiles who had bet everything on his success. By the time he marched inland, his army had swelled to nearly 5,000 men. Richard, upon hearing the news, wasted no time. He summoned his forces and rode north from Nottingham to intercept the invader. His banners, emblazoned with the white boar of York, fluttered in the late summer wind as he prepared to make his final stand near Bosworth Field, a quiet stretch of countryside in Leicestershire. For the soldiers on both sides, Bosworth was more than just a battlefield. It was the final act in a generation-long tragedy. The morning of August 22nd dawned with mist curling over the rolling hills and marshy fields. Birds fell silent as thousands of men took their positions. Longbowmen stringing their bows, cavalry tightening the leather straps of their armor, and foot soldiers clutching spears slick with dew. Richard's army was the larger, around 10,000 men, a formidable force. He commanded loyalty from powerful nobles, including the Duke of Norfolk and the Earl of Northumberland. But there was one man whose allegiance would decide everything: Thomas Lord Stanley. Stanley was an enigma. His wife, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was Henry Tudor's mother, yet he had served Richard loyally for years. When the battle began, Stanley's forces stood apart, watching from a hilltop, waiting. Neither side could be sure whose banner he would follow. The horns sounded. The air filled with the clang of steel and the roar of men. Richard's artillery opened fire, and the field erupted into chaos. Richard's knights, their armor gleaming in the morning light, charged down the slope, crashing into Henry's vanguard. Mud splattered, horses screamed, and the ground shook with the violence of it. Henry's troops, though smaller and less experienced, held their ground. They fought fiercely, their line bending but not breaking. Richard's men pressed forward, driving Henry's army back toward a marshy hollow. But as the melee thickened, something shifted, subtle at first, then decisive. Northumberland, commanding a large reserve, held his position instead of advancing. Whether by hesitation or quiet betrayal, his men never joined the fight. Richard's confidence began to waver. From his vantage point, he could see the banners of Stanley's troops still unmoving, their allegiance uncertain. It was as if the battlefield itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which way fate would lean. Then, amid the chaos, Richard saw something that ignited his final fatal act of courage. Across the field, Henry Tudor's standard fluttered near a small knot of men, lightly guarded, exposed. Henry himself, the challenger, stood there beneath a red dragon banner, directing his troops. In that instant, Richard made a decision that would be remembered for centuries. He would end the battle with one blow. Spurring his horse forward, Richard shouted, "Treason! Treason!" and led a direct charge through the melee. His white boar emblem gleamed as he cut down enemy soldiers in his path, aiming straight for Henry. His sword struck with precision and fury, a king fighting not for conquest, but for his crown, for his name, for everything that was slipping away. Contemporary accounts tell us that Richard's charge was almost successful. He came within yards of Henry, cutting down his standard-bearer and unseating several of his guards. But before he could reach his rival, Stanley's men finally moved, and they moved against him. Surrounded on all sides, Richard's horse was dragged into the marsh. He refused to flee. Witnesses later said he fought on foot, swinging his sword with desperate strength, shouting his defiance until the very end. When he fell, it was said he was struck down by a halberd blow to the head. His helmet was torn away, his skull cleaved open. His crown, knocked from his head, rolled into the mud, where legend has it, it was picked up and placed on Henry Tudor's brow. The battle lasted barely 2 hours, but in that short time, a dynasty ended and another began. Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty, marking the end of the Plantagenets and the beginning of modern England. His reign would usher in stability, prosperity, and a carefully crafted narrative, one in which Richard III became the villain of legend. For centuries, Richard's name would be synonymous with treachery and cruelty. Shakespeare would immortalize him as the twisted, hunchbacked king who murdered his nephews and clawed his way to the throne. "My kingdom for a horse," he cries in the play's final moments. A cry born not from cowardice, but from the chaos that had already claimed him. But history is rarely so simple. Modern historians have begun to see Richard in a different light, as a man of intelligence and reform, whose short reign introduced laws protecting commoners from corruption and improved access to justice. Perhaps they suggest Richard was not the monster painted by Tudor propaganda, but a ruler trapped in the wrong story. His body would lie undiscovered for over 500 years, buried beneath a nondescript parking lot in Leicestershire, until archaeologists uncovered it in 2012. His skeleton showed the wounds of that final battle, the fatal blows to the skull, the slashes to his ribs, the humiliation cuts inflicted after death. And yet, his spine, though curved, revealed not the grotesque deformity of legend, but a man whose physical imperfection had been exaggerated by those who wished to erase him. When Richard III was reinterred in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, thousands gathered to watch. The coffin of the last Plantagenet king was carried through the streets with solemn dignity, draped in cloth embroidered with his white boar emblem. For a moment, it felt as though history itself had paused, to listen, to remember, to forgive, and in that silence, the echoes of Bosworth could still be heard, the thundering hooves, the clash of steel, and the unyielding cry of a king who fought to the very last breath. For whatever else Richard III may have been, hero or villain, usurper or reformer, on that field, he was undeniably one thing above all, a man who faced his fate standing, Section 7. The Aftermath. How Henry VII rewrote the story. The Battle of Bosworth had ended, but the echoes of steel and shouts of men still lingered in the minds of those who had survived it. The field was silent now, scattered with the debris of ambition, broken armor, torn banners, and the bodies of the fallen. Among them lay Richard III, once King of England, his white boar standard trampled into the mud. Henry Tudor stood victorious. The crown that had rolled into the dirt, the crown that had slipped from Richard's dying head, was retrieved and placed upon Henry's. In that symbolic act, the age of the Plantagenets was over, and the Tudor dynasty was born. Yet, though the battle was won, Henry's real war had just begun. A war not of swords and armies, but of perception, memory, and history itself. For Henry knew that his claim to the throne was fragile. He was, by blood, only distantly related to the royal line. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, descended from the illegitimate offspring of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III. Without Richard's death and the extinction of the direct Yorkist line, Henry's crown would have been little more than a dream. And so, to secure his position, he needed not only to rule England, he needed to reshape its past. The first step was immediate and symbolic. Henry dated the start of his reign, not from the day he was crowned, but from the day before Bosworth. In doing so, he declared that everyone who had fought for Richard III, every knight, every archer, every noble, had technically committed treason. This single stroke of bureaucratic genius allowed Henry to seize the lands and wealth of Richard's supporters, crippling the Yorkist faction before they could rally. Next came the marriage. In January 1486, Henry wed Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster. The new emblem of England became the Tudor rose, white for York, red for Lancaster, a clever piece of political theater that presented Henry not as a conqueror, but as a healer of a wounded nation. But beneath this image of unity, a quieter, more calculated campaign was taking shape, a campaign to redefine Richard III's legacy. Henry understood that power was as much about stories as it was about armies. The people's loyalty could be commanded by fear, but it could only be sustained by belief in the righteousness of their king and the wickedness of his enemies. To that end, Henry's government began an organized effort to darken Richard's name. Chroniclers were encouraged, and sometimes instructed, to depict Richard as a deformed tyrant, a scheming murderer, a man consumed by ambition and devoid of conscience. The princes in the Tower became the cornerstone of this propaganda. The mystery of their disappearance had long haunted England. But under Henry's rule, the question of guilt was no longer debated. Richard, it was said, had ordered their deaths to secure his throne. Two innocent boys smothered in the dark of the Tower of London. Whether true or not, the story spread quickly. Monks, scholars, and royal historians all echoed the same refrain. Richard was unnatural, cruel, and malformed both in body and soul. His scoliosis, a curvature of the spine revealed centuries later in his remains, was exaggerated into a grotesque hunchback. His sharp features became the mark of inner evil. Even his wit and intelligence were turned against him, reimagined as cunning and deceit. In this new Tudor narrative, the Battle of Bosworth was not merely a victory. It was divine justice. Henry was cast as God's chosen ruler, bringing light after the darkness of Richard's tyranny. But it wasn't just official documents or court chroniclers who shaped this image. It was the arts. Under Tudor patronage, drama and literature became tools of political myth-making. The most famous example, of course, would come a century later, when William Shakespeare, writing under the reign of Elizabeth I, Henry's granddaughter, immortalized Richard as one of the most vivid villains in English literature. In Richard III, Shakespeare's words gave voice to Tudor propaganda in its most powerful form. His Richard was twisted in body and spirit, delighting in deceit, mocking virtue, and reveling in cruelty. "I am determined to prove a villain," he declares, a line that sealed his fate in the popular imagination for generations. It was brilliant theater, but terrible history. For centuries, this portrayal went unchallenged. School children learned of Richard's wickedness. Painters depicted him with dark eyes and a crooked spine. Even the term Plantagenet began to fade from memory, replaced by the glittering myth of Tudor rebirth. But behind the official story, the truth was more complex, and in some ways more tragic. Richard's short reign, though turbulent, was mocked by laws that sought fairness and reform. He outlawed the corrupt practice of forced loans, strengthened the rights of commoners to access justice, and protected the freedom of juries. His court of requests, often called the poor man's court, allowed the powerless to challenge the powerful, something unheard of in his time. Yet none of that mattered once he was dead. In life, Richard had ruled by sword and decree. In death, he was ruled by the pen. Henry's propaganda machine worked so effectively that by the end of the 15th century, the idea of Richard as a villain had become indistinguishable from fact. Those who questioned it were dismissed as disloyal or foolish. The monarchy, newly stabilized under the Tudors, had no interest in revisiting uncomfortable truths. And so the story endured, century after century, until one of history's most remarkable rediscoveries brought it all back into question. In 2012, over 500 years after the Battle of Bosworth, a small archaeological team began excavating a car park in Leicester, following a hunch that had sat atop the long-lost Greyfriars Church, where Richard's remains were rumored to have been buried. What they found shocked the world. Beneath layers of asphalt and centuries of soil lay the skeleton of a man whose spine curved in a distinctive S-shape. His skull bore the marks of battle wounds, including the fatal blow to the back of the head. Forensic testing confirmed what few had dared hope. It was Richard III. In an instant, the caricature born of Tudor politics was replaced by the humanity of a real man. His skeleton told a story not of monstrous deformity, but of resilience. His bones showed signs of pain endured, of strength maintained, of a life cut brutally short. When his remains were reinterred in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, Tens of thousands came to pay their respects. For the first time in 5 centuries, the last Plantagenet king was granted the dignity he had been denied in death. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: Henry VII won the war of history, but Richard III won something rarer: redemption through time. For in the quiet, patient work of scholars, archaeologists, and truth-seekers, the mask of myth has been slowly lifted, revealing not the monster of legend, but a man, complex, flawed, and deeply human. And in that revelation lies one of history's most poetic lessons. Even kings can be rewritten, but truth has a way of resurfacing, sometimes centuries later, beneath a parking lot. Section 8. The Skeleton Beneath the Asphalt. Rediscovery of a King. For more than 5 centuries, the story of Richard III seemed sealed, a tale written by victors, gilded by myth, and set firmly in the past. He was the hunchbacked villain of Shakespeare, the usurper king lost to history, and the final breath of a dynasty extinguished in mud and betrayal. His body, like his legacy, was thought to have vanished forever, dumped in some unmarked grave, erased by time and politics. Yet history, as it often does, had a quiet surprise waiting beneath the surface, quite literally beneath the surface of a modern English city. In 2012, on an unassuming stretch of asphalt in Leicester, archaeologist Philippa Langley stood in a car park with a feeling she couldn't quite explain. Around her, cars came and went, tires rolling over oil-stained pavement, unaware of the centuries layered beneath them. She wasn't a professional archaeologist by training. She was a writer, a historian of passion rather than degree. But something about this place stirred her intuition. She believed, against all logic, that the long-lost remains of King Richard III lay here. To most, the idea sounded absurd. After all, Richard had fallen in battle in 1485, buried hastily by monks at Greyfriars Church, which had long since vanished under centuries of urban development. No one even knew where Greyfriars had stood. Maps of old Leicester offered vague hints, fragments of memory blurred by time. But Langley, meticulous and driven, studied every scrap of evidence: ancient records, property deeds, church lists, and her conviction only grew stronger. With support from the Richard III Society and local archaeologists at the University of Leicester, she launched an excavation. It was small, limited, and funded more by passion than money. Few believed they'd find anything beyond medieval rubble. The dig began on August 25, 2012. Excavators carved narrow trenches into the car park surface, each layer of earth revealing faint traces of what once had been. The first days passed quietly. Broken tiles, shards of pottery, bits of bone, nothing extraordinary. But then, as the dig deepened, the soil began to change color, and something caught an archaeologist's eye. A human leg bone. At first, the discovery was treated cautiously. Leicester is a city built upon layers of history, and human remains are not unusual. Yet, as the trench widened, the skeleton that emerged began to tell a strange and haunting story. The spine was curved, not the exaggerated hunch of legend, but a graceful S-shaped scoliosis, the mark of a man who would have stood tall, yet slightly uneven. His skull bore signs of multiple wounds, clean cuts, likely made by swords, halberds, or daggers. One injury in particular, a fatal blow to the back of the head, had sliced deep into the bone, the kind of wound inflicted by a weapon swung in the chaos of battle. The team worked in silence, aware that they might be touching the remains of someone remarkable. When the skeleton was finally lifted from the earth, the air seemed to still. Even the hum of the city faded. There was a sense of reverence, as though time itself had paused to watch. The bones were taken to the University of Leicester for analysis. Every step was done with care, respect, and a growing sense of awe. Radiocarbon dating placed the remains in the late 15th century. The spinal curvature, the battle wounds, the age of death, all aligned perfectly with historical accounts of Richard III. But science demanded certainty, so the team turned to DNA. Samples were extracted from the skeleton's teeth and compared to living descendants of Richard's family line. Specifically, relatives descended from his sister, Anne of York. The process was delicate and took months. When the results came back, the conclusion was undeniable. The mitochondrial DNA matched. Against all odds, against the erosion of centuries, they had found him, the last Plantagenet King of England, buried not in a grand tomb or royal chapel, but beneath a car park in the middle of Leicester. News of the discovery spread around the world. Historians wept. Journalists swarmed. The modern age, with its satellites and skyscrapers, stood face to face with the Middle Ages once more. For many, it felt as though Richard had reached across 500 years to reclaim his name. But the find did more than rewrite one man's story. It changed the way the world saw history itself. It reminded us that history isn't a fixed record, etched in stone. It's alive, buried in the earth, waiting for someone to listen. The skeleton revealed things the propaganda could not. For one, Richard's scoliosis would not have made him grotesque or twisted, as Tudor myth claimed. Modern reconstruction showed he would have stood at about 5 feet 8 inches, slightly uneven in one shoulder, but physically capable and strong, far from the deformed monster of legend. He was a man who likely carried his pain with dignity. The wounds on his bones painted a vivid picture of his final moments. The skull wounds showed that he fought bravely, unhorsed but not surrendering, struck from behind as his helmet was lost. Other cuts along his ribs and pelvis suggested that, after death, his body was humiliated, stripped, exposed, and struck again. The violence of the Tudor victory extended even into death. When the analysis was complete and the identification confirmed, the question arose, where should the king be reburied? Some argued that York Minster, in the city Richard loved and once ruled from, was the right place. Others insisted that his bones should remain in Leicester, where he had been found. The debate grew passionate, almost poetic, as if England itself was trying to decide where the memory of its fallen king belonged. Eventually, it was decided that Richard would be reinterred in Leicester Cathedral, near the site of his discovery. The ceremony took place in March 2015, attended by royalty, historians, and citizens from across the world. His coffin, simple and carved from English oak, was borne through the streets by pallbearers in medieval armor. Crowds lined the roads, tossing white roses, the emblem of York, as the procession passed. For a few moments, it seemed as though the centuries dissolved. The echoes of Bosworth grew faint, the myths fell silent, and Richard, once condemned by history, was honored as a king at last. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, the choir's voices rose softly through the cathedral. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. And perhaps he finally did. Beneath the modern hum of Leicester, amid the shadows of passing clouds, a king once lost had come home. Not to a throne, but to truth. Section 9. The Making of a Villain, How Shakespeare Sealed His Fate. History, they say, is written by the victors, but sometimes it's performed by them too. In the case of King Richard III, his defeat at Bosworth was not only the end of his reign, but the beginning of his transformation, from man to monster, from king to caricature. For more than a century after his death, Richard's story would be shaped, twisted, and staged until his name became synonymous with treachery, ambition, and evil. And the man most responsible for this immortal distortion was none other than William Shakespeare. But to understand how this transformation happened, we must first travel back to the turbulent politics of the Tudor dynasty and to the world in which Shakespeare lived and wrote. When Shakespeare was born in 1564, England had been ruled by the Tudors for nearly 80 years. Queen Elizabeth I, granddaughter of Henry VII, sat on the throne. Her grandfather's victory at Bosworth had ended the Wars of the Roses and established the Tudor line, but it was a fragile legitimacy. The Tudors knew that their claim to the crown was not rooted deeply in blood, but in conquest. To maintain that claim, they needed a story, a moral justification, and so a narrative was woven. Henry VII, noble and destined, had liberated England from the tyranny of a usurping, deformed, murderous king. That king was Richard III. From the moment the Tudors seized power, historians, chroniclers, and artists were enlisted to reinforce this tale. Among them was Sir Thomas More, who, in the early 1500s, wrote a vivid account of Richard's crimes, accusing him of murdering his nephews, manipulating his court, and scheming his way to power. Though More's account was never completed and may have been more legend than fact, it became the foundation for the Richard we would all come to know. By the time Shakespeare took up his pen, this version of Richard was already entrenched in public consciousness. Yet Shakespeare, with his unmatched command of language and drama, would give that image a soul, dark, magnetic, unforgettable. In the tragedy of King Richard III, written around 1593, Shakespeare crafted one of the most compelling villains in all of literature. His Richard was not just evil, he was eloquent in his evil. A schemer, yes, but also a poet. He confided in the audience with wicked charm, turning them into silent accomplices in his rise and fall. "I am determined to prove a villain," he declares in the opening lines, his words dripping with venomous delight. It is a performance so powerful that audiences, even centuries later, still shudder at its brilliance. Yet behind the artistry, Shakespeare's Richard was a weapon, a political and cultural tool. His monstrous image was not a reflection of history, but of Tudor propaganda. The physical deformity, for example, the famous hunchback, the twisted arm, was not described by any of Richard's contemporaries. It was a literary invention, a symbol of inner corruption made flesh. To Shakespeare's Elizabethan audience, outward deformity was often seen as a sign of moral decay, a visible manifestation of sin. Thus, by portraying Richard as both physically and spiritually crooked, Shakespeare was reaffirming Tudor legitimacy. But what makes Shakespeare's portrayal endure, and what makes it so complex, is that his Richard is not only a villain, he is, paradoxically, charismatic, intelligent, even sympathetic in his loneliness. That, perhaps, is the playwright's genius, and also his cruelty. Because in giving Richard such a mesmerizing voice, Shakespeare ensured that his version of the man would eclipse the truth. For nearly 400 years, the real Richard III, the warrior king, the loyal brother, the ruler who passed early legal reforms and supported commoners, would be overshadowed by this fictional counterpart. Children would learn of him as a murderer. His name would become a metaphor for treachery. Even the discovery of his remains in the 21st century would not fully undo the power of Shakespeare's pen. It is almost poetic, isn't it, that a king who lost his crown on the battlefield would lose his soul on the stage. Yet modern historians have begun to peel back the layers of fiction, revealing a man far more complicated than the myth allows. Records from his reign show that Richard was a competent administrator, known for fairness and innovation. He banned restrictions on book printing, encouraged local justice, and worked to make courts more accessible to ordinary citizens. He even protected the rights of widows, an unusual act of compassion for the era. None of this fit the image of a bloodthirsty tyrant, but truth, once buried under centuries of propaganda and theater, is slow to surface. When the skeleton of Richard III was found in 2012, something extraordinary happened. Historians began to speak of rehabilitation, a reevaluation of a life long misunderstood. For the first time, the world could see the man Shakespeare had turned into a monster. The curvature of his spine was real, yes, but not grotesque. His face, reconstructed from bone, was thoughtful, even gentle. His stature, once mocked, was dignified. It became clear that his deformity had been exaggerated for political and dramatic effect. He was not the hunched ghoul of the stage, but a human being, wounded, complex, tragic. In a sense, Shakespeare's Richard III became a mirror, reflecting the fears and ambitions of his time rather than the reality of the man himself. He was a warning against ambition, a dramatization of divine justice, and a testament to how art can immortalize a lie more powerfully than truth. And yet, in a beautiful twist of irony, the rediscovery of Richard's bones has also redeemed Shakespeare's vision, not in content, but in spirit. For what is Shakespeare's Richard III if not a meditation on legacy, on how power corrupts, how memory deceives, and how the dead are never truly silent? Even now, when actors take the stage to whisper Richard's cunning soliloquies, there is a strange echo, a reminder that somewhere beneath the earth of Leicester, the real man lies, his story slowly reawakening from centuries of slander. It's as though history and theater are locked in a quiet dialogue, each trying to outlive the other. And in that dialogue lies a haunting truth. Richard's greatest tragedy may not have been his defeat at Bosworth, but his eternal victory in the wrong form, not as king, but as character. His crown was lost, but his story was never forgotten. Section 10. The Missing Princes. The mystery that stained his reign. Few mysteries in English history cast a shadow as long or as cold as the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. Two boys whose vanishing would forever haunt the legacy of their uncle, King Richard III. Their story is woven into the very heart of his legend, and it is here, in this haunting silence between fact and accusation, that the line between truth and myth dissolves completely. The year was 1483. King Edward IV, Richard's elder brother, had died unexpectedly, leaving behind two sons, Edward, aged 12, and Richard, Duke of York, aged 9. According to tradition, the young Edward was to be crowned king as Edward V, with his uncle Richard serving as Lord Protector until he came of age. At first, the arrangement seemed peaceful enough. Richard was respected by many nobles and loved by the northern lords. He was known for his integrity, his discipline, and his loyalty to his brother's memory. Few suspected the storm that was about to break. As the young king traveled to London for his coronation, Richard intercepted his entourage, arrested several of the boy's advisors, including the influential Earl Rivers, the Queen's brother, and escorted Edward to the Tower of London. It was customary for kings to stay in the Tower before their coronation, but this time the gates would not reopen so easily. Soon after, the younger prince, Edward's brother, the Duke of York, joined him. Together, the two boys were confined within the tower's thick stone walls. Their coronation was postponed once, then again, until finally it was cancelled altogether. Within weeks, whispers began to spread across London. The princes had vanished, and almost overnight, their uncle, Richard, declared himself king, Richard III. To his supporters, this was a necessary act of stability. Rumors had surfaced, conveniently, that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, making his sons illegitimate. Parliament, influenced by Richard's allies, accepted the claim. Richard was crowned on July 6, 1483, and the princes were never seen again. No bodies, no trial, no official record, only silence, and a question that would echo through centuries. What happened to the princes in the Tower? The simplest, most damning version of events is the one that history's victors chose, that Richard ordered their deaths. It fits the narrative, the ruthless usurper removing the last obstacles to his throne. Chroniclers under the Tudors, such as Thomas More and Polydore Virgil, would later depict the scene with chilling vividness. The children smothered in their sleep by hired assassins, their bodies buried at the stair foot, deep in the ground. But there's a problem with that story. Several, in fact. For one, the supposed confession that More based his account on was never confirmed, and many details appear suspiciously convenient for Tudor propaganda. The murderers' names, the method, the secrecy, all read like a dramatization rather than documentation. Moreover, Richard had little to gain by killing the princes so soon. Their disappearance destabilized his reign, fueling rebellion and whispers of divine punishment. A man as politically sharp as Richard would have known that such an act would make him vulnerable. And if he truly had them killed, why not prove their deaths to eliminate rumors of their survival? Some historians argue that the princes may have been killed later, but by someone else. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard at Bosworth in 1485 and became Henry VII, he too had a motive to erase any remaining Yorkist claimants. If even one of the princes had survived, Henry's fragile claim to the throne would crumble. It is not impossible, some say, that the boys lived beyond Richard's death, only to meet their fate under the new king's reign. Then there's an even stranger theory, that at least one of the princes escaped. In the years following Richard's death, a man named Perkin Warbeck appeared in Europe, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince. He spoke fluent English and French, had the manners of nobility, and was recognized by several individuals who had once served at Edward IV's court. Warbeck's rebellion against Henry VII failed, and he was executed in 1499. But the mystery lingered. Could he have been telling the truth? No one can say for certain. What we do know is that in 1674, nearly 200 years after the princes disappeared, workmen repairing the White Tower discovered a wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the small bones of two children, lying side by side. The remains were interred in Westminster Abbey, as those of the princes. But even this discovery raised more questions than it answered. The bones were never examined scientifically until the 20th century, and even then, the results were inconclusive. The skeletons were those of children, yes, but the age, the date, and even the sex of the remains could not be confirmed with certainty. In fact, several other children were known to have died within the tower's walls over the centuries. So the mystery remains open, cold, and tantalizingly incomplete. What's fascinating is not only the question of who killed the princes, but why the mystery endures at all. The disappearance of the boys has become more than a historical puzzle. It's a mirror reflecting the fears and politics of each generation that revisits it. To some, it's a symbol of innocence lost to power. To others, it's an early example of spin, propaganda shaping a nation's collective memory. And for many, it's simply a haunting reminder of how easily truth can be buried beneath the stones of time. Richard III's reign lasted just over 2 years, a blink in history's long march. Yet this single event became the defining stain on his legacy. Whether he was guilty or not, it trapped his name forever between sympathy and suspicion. And perhaps that is the cruelest twist of all, because in the end, the truth of what happened to the princes may matter less than the power of the story itself. The tower's cold walls hold no witnesses now, only silence and the echo of footsteps that might once have been small and hurried, fading into darkness. Even today, when you walk through the Tower of London, you can almost feel it, a quiet presence lingering near the bloody tower where the boys were last seen. The air seems to shift slightly, heavy with centuries of unspoken questions. Were they victims of politics or survivors lost to history? Were they murdered by their uncle or by a usurper desperate to erase them? We may never know, but perhaps, as long as their story is told, the princes have not been entirely lost. Their voices remain, faint but eternal, whispering through the corridors of power and time. Section 11. The Skeleton Beneath the Car Park. The Search That Changed Everything. For over 5 centuries, King Richard III existed more as a legend than a man, a name wrapped in myth, accusation, and Shakespearean drama. His death at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 marked the end of both his life and the Plantagenet dynasty, yet no one knew where his body had gone. Historians speculated endlessly, but his final resting place seemed lost forever, until one gray September morning in 2012, when a dig beneath an unremarkable car park in Leicester unearthed something extraordinary. It began not with a government grant or an academic institution, but with a woman named Philippa Langley. She was not a historian by profession, but an ordinary person fascinated by Richard's story, convinced that he had been unfairly vilified by Tudor propaganda. Langley was a member of the Richard III Society, a group dedicated to re-examining his legacy and seeking truth over myth. For years, she had been haunted by the question, where was Richard buried? According to surviving documents, after Richard's death in battle, his naked body had been slung over a horse and taken to Leicester as a trophy. Chroniclers claimed he was displayed publicly, then buried in the Church of the Grey Friars, a Franciscan monastery in the town, but the monastery itself had been destroyed during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. The land had changed hands countless times since, eventually covered by streets, buildings, and later, a car park. Langley was drawn to that car park almost instinctively. During a site visit, she reportedly felt an inexplicable tingling sensation while standing over a particular spot marked with a simple painted R. Whether coincidence or something more, that moment would lead to one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. She began gathering historians, archaeologists, and fundraisers, convincing the University of Leicester Archaeological Services to undertake an excavation. Few took it seriously. After all, the odds of finding a 15th-century royal burial beneath asphalt were astronomically low. Yet, with persistence and a little luck, the dig began on August 25, 2012. Precisely 527 years after Richard's death. The trench was only a few meters wide. On the first day, the team unearthed the remains of medieval walls, fragments of the Grey Friars Church. Then, only a few days later, they uncovered something human. It was a skeleton, lying in a shallow grave, hastily buried, arms crossed over the chest. The spine was severely curved, the bones of the skull showing clear signs of trauma. The grave was too small for a coffin, suggesting a burial made in haste or without ceremony. When Philippa Langley saw the remains, she felt she already knew. Could this truly be Richard III? Over the following months, a meticulous process of analysis began. Every bone was studied, every injury examined, every fragment of DNA compared. The evidence, piece by piece, began to form an astonishing picture. The skeleton's spine, twisted in an S-shaped curve, matched descriptions of Richard's scoliosis, the same deformity that Shakespeare exaggerated into a crooked back. The injuries to the skull were consistent with accounts from Bosworth. 2 massive blows from bladed weapons, one likely delivered by a sword or halberd after his helmet had been removed. The position of the body and the shallow grave indicated a man of importance buried without honor, perhaps even in secrecy. But the most convincing clue came from DNA. Scientists extracted genetic material from the skeleton's teeth and compared it to living descendants of Richard's maternal line. Specifically, Michael Ibsen, a Canadian cabinet maker and confirmed descendant of Richard's sister, Anne of York. The mitochondrial DNA matched. On February 4, 2013, the University of Leicester announced what few had dared to believe. The remains found beneath the car park were those of King Richard III. The news reverberated around the world. For the first time, history's most controversial monarch had a face, and, unexpectedly, a second chance at truth. As researchers reconstructed Richard's features from his skull, something remarkable emerged. The face that appeared was not the monstrous figure painted by Shakespeare, not a sneering villain or hunchbacked fiend, but a man of intelligence, dignity, and weary sadness. His eyes, calm and alert, seemed to challenge centuries of distortion. For many, this discovery did more than locate a lost body. It restored humanity to a man who had been turned into myth. Yet even in this triumph of science, questions lingered. Why had his body been buried in such a humble grave? Some evidence suggested he may have received a proper Christian burial by the friars, only for the grave to be destroyed when the monastery fell. Others wondered whether his conqueror, Henry Tudor, had deliberately chosen to obscure Richard's resting place, to erase his presence from England's soil. Whatever the reason, the centuries had kept Richard hidden, waiting quietly beneath the world's modern noise until the moment came for him to be found. In March 2015, Richard III was finally reburied in Leicester Cathedral, in a ceremony watched by millions. His coffin, crafted by Michael Ibsen himself, the descendant whose DNA confirmed his identity, was carried through the city streets, draped in the royal standard. Crowds gathered silently, some weeping, as they witnessed the reinterment of a king who had been lost for over 500 years. It was a rare moment when history and emotion merged, where the distant past suddenly felt alive and near. For archaeologists, it was a triumph of patience and faith in evidence. For the public, it was a reminder that even legends, however twisted by time, can sometimes speak again. And for Richard, perhaps, it was a kind of peace. The man who died branded a villain was at last granted dignity in death. Beneath the carved stone slab that now marks his tomb are the words, Richard III, King of England, 1483 to 1485. It is a simple inscription, deliberate, humble, and without judgment, because, in truth, history itself has never decided whether Richard was hero or monster. What the car park discovery gave us was not an answer to every question, but something gentler, more human, the chance to remember him as he truly was, flawed, complex, and achingly real. Perhaps that is the true gift of finding Richard's remains. For centuries, he was only a ghost in stories, but when the sunlight touched his bones, for the first time since 1485, the centuries between then and now seemed to dissolve, and for a brief, shimmering moment, the man behind the myth stood visible once again. Section 12. The Tudor Shadow. How Propaganda Rewrote His Memory. When King Richard III fell at Bosworth Field, his death marked not only the end of a reign, but also the beginning of a story written by his enemies. History, as it often does, was penned by the victors, and in Richard's case, those victors were the Tudors, who had every reason to ensure that England remembered the fallen king not as a tragic figure, but as a monster. To understand how Richard's reputation became so darkly stained, one must first look to the anxious years that followed 1485. Henry Tudor, who claimed the throne through a distant and fragile lineage, had defeated Richard by chance as much as by valor. His hold on England was shaky at best. Yorkist supporters still lurked in the shadows, and the kingdom, weary of decades of war, remained restless and divided. For Henry VII, legitimacy was everything. And what better way to strengthen one's claim than to demonize the man who came before you? Thus began one of the most calculated campaigns of political myth-making in English history. Through chronicles, sermons, and later through the rise of the printing press, a new version of Richard III was created, one that suited the Tudors' narrative of good conquering evil. Richard, they claimed, had murdered his nephews, the famous princes in the Tower. He had usurped the throne, betraying his own blood. He was deformed both in body and soul, a reflection of divine judgment. Each story, each exaggeration, layered over the last until the real man was obscured completely. In truth, there had been no solid proof of these crimes. Even the alleged murder of the princes rested on rumor and hearsay. But in the unstable world of post-war England, truth mattered less than belief. The Tudors understood this, and so they gave the people a simple narrative to hold on to, a villain to blame, a dark chapter that justified their bright new dynasty. It is a curious thing how quickly myth can harden into fact. Chroniclers like Thomas More, a devout servant of Henry VIII, wrote with moral fervor, painting Richard as a scheming, bloodthirsty tyrant. Later, Polydore Virgil, writing under Tudor commission, added even more venom to the portrait. Each pen stroke was another brick in the fortress of propaganda that would defend the Tudor legacy for centuries to come. But the true immortalization of Richard's villainy came decades later through the genius of William Shakespeare. His play, Richard III, written in the 1590s under the reign of Elizabeth I, Henry Tudor's granddaughter, was the culmination of nearly a century of crafted distortion. On the Elizabethan stage, Richard became more than a man. He became an archetype, twisted in body and corrupted in mind. He strutted across the wooden boards like a dark reflection of ambition itself. "Now is the winter of our discontent," he proclaimed, his words dripping with charm and malice. The audience shuddered and marveled, enthralled by the spectacle of evil dressed in wit. For Shakespeare, the deformity of Richard's spine symbolized his moral corruption, a theatrical device that fit neatly with Tudor morality plays. Yet history, as the centuries would later prove, had not been so simple. The real Richard had indeed suffered from scoliosis, as confirmed by his skeleton found beneath a Leicester car park. But he was no monstrous hunchback, nor a man cursed from birth. He was, by every surviving account from his own time, intelligent, composed, and deeply religious. Still, in the public imagination, Shakespeare's version became the truth. Through theater and text, Richard's shadow stretched across generations. Painters, playwrights, and poets all repeated the same image: the crooked king, the child murderer, the usurper. For more than 400 years, that was the only Richard the world knew. And yet, buried beneath those centuries of accusation, there remained whispers of doubt. Even in the earliest Tudor years, a few voices dared to speak softly in Richard's defense. Records from the city of York, for example, describe the reaction to his death not with celebration but with sorrow. One contemporary entry read simply, "King Richard, late mercifully reigning upon us, was piteously slain and murdered to the great heaviness of this city." That single line, fragile, quiet, stands in stark contrast to the roaring accusations of his enemies. It hints at another truth, one that the propaganda could not entirely erase: that Richard, for some, had been a fair ruler, perhaps even a just one. He had enacted laws protecting the poor against the powerful, improved the justice system, and ensured that legal representation was available to those who could not afford it. These reforms, ahead of their time, were forgotten under the weight of the monstrous myth. But memory is a resilient thing. Over the centuries, a small number of historians began to re-examine the old stories, to ask, what if Richard was not the villain history had made him out to be? In the 20th century, scholars like Paul Murray Kendall and organizations such as the Richard III Society began to sift through the Tudor layers. They compared chronicles, tested claims, and questioned motives. Slowly, piece by piece, a more complex portrait emerged, not of a saint, but of a man caught in the brutal machinery of medieval politics. Richard's story began to shift again, this time not by royal decree or playwright's pen, but by the careful hands of evidence and empathy. The rediscovery of his bones in 2012 did more than solve an archaeological mystery. It symbolized the undoing of 5 centuries of propaganda. The twisted spine, once used to prove evil, became a symbol of endurance, of truth surviving beneath centuries of falsehood. It reminds us of something profoundly human, that power can write history, but it cannot erase reality. Beneath the Tudor shadow, beneath the plays and propaganda, the real Richard had always remained, waiting to be seen once more. The irony is almost poetic. The man who had been buried beneath lies was literally buried beneath the modern world, hidden under a car park. And when he was unearthed, so too was the truth. His story, once shaped by fear and politics, now belongs to the quiet voices of curiosity, evidence, and time. And in that, perhaps, there is redemption. The Tudors may have rewritten Richard's memory, but they could not rewrite eternity.